This is my 87th video on my work with OO gauge. See part 1 of this series for my reasons for getting into OO gauge when I already had a lot invested in working in N gauge, and I didn't really have space available for a large, fully operational OO gauge layout. Also see my lengthy series on my N gauge railway model and for smaller and more complex scenery and smaller scale trains running. This part is about me working out ideas for a shelf layout, and then initiating work on building a shelf layout. If you've watched my videos previously, you'll probably be aware that I'm rather prone to running off in different directions, always picking up on some idea that I see somewhere, and at least wondering about starting something new based on it. And with still being restricted because of COVID issues from doing a lot of the activities outside the house that I might normally pursue, to say nothing of the fact that anyway it's midwinter here in Canada and damn cold and snowy outside, discouraging even those activities that are still permitted, well, I was quite keen to have a new project to pursue in my own home. But I just didn't have space to expand my existing layouts or to fit a new tabletop OO or N-gauge layout anywhere. I did muse about Z-gauge. With a scale of 1 to 220 and a track gauge of 6.5mm, modest Z-gauge layouts can be fitted into quite tiny spaces, even being made portable inside something like a suitcase. But I have enough trouble trying to service N-gauge rolling stock without trying something even smaller, and obtaining British rolling stock corresponding to my interests in Z-gauge would be really difficult. For example, the number of listings on eBay for Z-gauge is about 1/10 of the number for OO gauge, and the majority of the Z-gauge stuff seems to be based on continental European, American or Japanese prototypes. So, for now at least, I gave up on the Z-gauge idea, although if I ran across some rolling stock that appealed to me in Z-gauge, ideally pre-war LMS, then I might well be tempted to revisit the idea. However, for now, I decided that a more immediately practical idea might be a shelf layout, that is, a layout built entirely on a shelf going along a wall, or even better, a couple of walls. Even that wasn't easy in my already very cluttered house. Looking around, I came to the conclusion that basically the only place I could reasonably build a shelf layout would be along the walls above my existing Hornby layout. This would have its advantages and its disadvantages. It would be quite handy having the two layouts in the same room. I could even run trains on both of them at the same time, and they could share rolling stock storage and even the same primary power switching. But building things above the existing Hornby layout would be a bit tough, since that layout is not movable, so I'd have to lean right over it to get at the shelf above it. That one has already proved somewhat difficult, and may come back to haunt me even more in future. Nevertheless, I felt that this could be done. I decided to stick with OO gauge and with Hornby and Pico track, making this in some ways an extension of my existing Hornby layout. I did my design just by playing around cutting and pasting in a graphics program, as I did for my previous layouts. This was my first idea, just 2 tracks going end to end all the way along the 2 walls, with a 3rd track branching off. At first I thought of using curve points on the corner, but I again abandoned that idea, as what you can do with them is rather restricted, and many people seem to have reliability issues with them. I had seen several YouTube videos where shuttle control units were used to allow trains on an end-to-end layout to run back and forth automatically. I thought that this was an interesting idea and was quite keen to try it. Indeed, that was partially what pushed me into the whole shelf idea in the first place, as neither of my existing layouts lent itself to the use of a shuttle run. The shuttle control units are not that expensive. I was able to order 2 units like this with shipping to Canada for just over £40. I still haven't received them, so any practical demonstration will have to wait for a future video. This is the wiring diagram for the shuttle units that I ordered. Basically, they input power from a regular track controller, then they have 4 outputs. One of the outputs goes to one rail of the track, which is continuous from end to end with no breaks in it. The other rail of the track must have 2 breaks in it, separating off short sections at either end. The shuttling train will stop when it gets to one of these end sections, pause, and then start back in the opposite direction. Obviously, the brakes in the rail at the end will need to be positioned to make the train stop where you want it to, without any part of the train hitting the buffers at the end of the track, but also without the carriages of the train hanging off the platform, assuming this stop will be in a station, and how would it make any sense otherwise? This does mean that you'll need to be fairly consistent as to the composition of the train running the shuttle. This presented a bit of a problem for me. Really, the shuttles are most obviously suited to things like DMUs, but since I model LMS operations in the 1930s, that wasn't an option for me. Generally, normal steam trains would not run back and forth with exactly the same composition. They would be drawn to their destination by an engine, then either that engine would run round the train and couple to the other end for the return journey, or another engine would come up and couple to the other end of the train. There was, however, a kind of train that did run back and forth without changing its composition, the push and pull unit. These were created precisely to run back and forth on lines where it was difficult or impossible to run around the train or to reverse engines. They got around the problem by allowing the train to be driven from the back, essentially. That is to say, a driving cab existed at the end of the carriage at the rear of the train, and special connections existed to allow a driver in that cab to operate the basic controls of the steam engine at the other end of the train. There would, of course, still be a fireman on the engine to maintain the fire, inject water into the boiler, etc. The train would generally only have a couple of carriages, and the engine would generally be a small tank loco of some sort. In order to allow me to emulate this with my shuttle, I bought a couple of these push and pull coaches on eBay. I haven't received them yet. They're actually BR items, as I don't think anyone has ever made a specific LMS push and pull unit, but they're maroon, and I can probably make them pass for LMS Crimson. A bit of a fudge, but I think I can live with it. Now I thought a bit more about my design. Clearly there should be stations at each end so that trains had something reasonable to stop at. I decided for this layout to depart from using platforms built from the Metcalfe card kits, as I had mostly done for my other layouts, and instead to use the Hornby plastic platforms. They're not ideal, obviously, being a bit unrealistic in some ways, but I felt they had a certain charm of their own, so I decided to give them a go this time. I modified my layout design slightly to allow for platforms on either side of the 2 main tracks at each end. I felt that the 3rd track at the left-hand station should be able to just use the other side of the right-hand platform. My curves may not quite fit onto the shelf in the corner. If they don't, I can insert some kind of small piece of extra surface just in the corner. For one of the stations, I decided to use this Hornby Terminus Station kit, which had always rather appealed to me, so I bought this on eBay UK and it should be on its way to me. For the station at the other end, I'm going to also use Hornby platforms, but I wanted to use something different for the buildings. This is the Super Quick Terminus Station card kit, and I think it should work quite nicely, maybe with a little bit of adaptation. I was able to pick this kit up locally from British Model Trains in Cambridge, Ontario. I did also buy a couple of extra Hornby roof units, as I think I'd like to put roofs over the platforms on both stations. I also bought a background to go behind the shelf. This is the ID Backscenes 24-inch English Village background, the same one that I used for my Bachmann layout in the basement. I may live to regret this, as trying to put it up is going to be extremely difficult with the existing Hornby layout in the way. I'll just have to try to gauge what is feasible when the vaccine arrives. It's coming from Australia, as I couldn't find anyone other than an Australian vendor with a 24-inch vinyl version in stock. I was watching OO Bill's video of how he combined the use of a shuttle control with an alternative operating method of just uncoupling the original engine and bringing another engine up and coupling it to the other end of the train, then pulling the train away, drawn by the new engine, leaving the original engine in place at the end of the platform, having switched off the power to that section, which was already isolated due to the shuttle requirements. I thought that this made a lot of sense and would allow me a much wider range of operational possibilities. But if I was going to operate in that way, I would want to keep my trains running on the left-hand track, so I would want to switch the train over from one track to the other as soon as it pulled out of the station. So to accommodate this, I revised my layout plan again, dispensing with the crossover near the corner and instead placing right to left crossovers just outside each station. Now, just to refresh memories, here's the wiring diagram for the shuttles again. To accommodate the alternate method of operating, I would want to switch out the shuttles and to be able to manually switch off power to the end sections of the track, those marked B and D here, to allow for leaving the original engine behind in the station when taking the train out with the new engine coupled to the other end. So this is how I think I need to wire things. 2 4-pole two-way switches will allow the track connections to be connected either to the shuttle or directly to the speed controller, simply by flipping those switches. Then each of the power feeds to the isolated end sections will have its own separate on-off switch, shown as purple circles here, to allow the power to those sections to be manually turned off. That would be done when operating without the shuttle. When operating with the shuttle, those on-off switches would be left on to allow the shuttle to control things. Of course, this is intended just as a schematic diagram to indicate the wiring connections. The controllers and switches are not drawn to scale or in the positions where they would actually be. I'm thinking that it should be possible to mount everything except the speed controller on a fairly small board, perhaps a piece of thin plywood or something similar. Anyway, that's as far as I've got with planning. I've bought most things, but I have to wait for them to be delivered, which can take quite a while with post to Canada these days. I do have my track, as I picked that up locally from British Model Trains. I'm using Hornby track for the points and curves and Pico Flex track for the long straights. And all of this week I've been building the shelf. My first thought for the shelving was these 16-inch by 72-inch laminated panels from Home Depot as advertised on their website. But when I actually went to Home Depot, these seemed to be useless. Every single one they had in stock was already split. They did have some similar panels that were in good condition, but those were only 5 foot long rather than 6 foot, and cost $55 each before tax. I did actually load those panels onto my cart and was going to get 2 of them cut down slightly by Home Depot. They can make cuts much better than I can with their professional cutting equipment, and they'll do a couple of cuts for free when you buy things and charge $1 a cut after the first 2. To mount those boards, I selected these heavy-duty brackets, as the boards weighed quite a bit. But whilst I was waiting for the cuts to get made, and it was a long wait as most of the Home Depot lumber staff were off sick, I changed my mind again. I saw this pack of white foam sheets, much cheaper and much lighter. I figured these should work fine for supporting a model railway layout, so I put the laminated wooden boards back and bought these instead. I also put back the heavy-duty brackets and bought these instead, as these lighter brackets seemed quite strong enough to support foam sheets with a railway layout. I actually also found when I got home that I still had 4 sheets of this other type of white foam still on hand. I used these sheets, a bit thinner than the others but a bit longer and wider, to make the board surface for my Bachmann layout in the basement, and also to make hills for both Bachmann and the Hornby layout. And as I say, I still had 4 of these sheets on hand. The very first thing I did was to judge about what height I wanted to fit the shelf. and then I drew a pencil line all along the wall using a spirit level. This line went all along the back wall behind my existing Hornby layout, and round to the far corner of the room. It can't be helped that the window is in the way. Here's the line in the corner above the Hornby layout, probably the most difficult part to reach. And here's the line above the back of the existing Hornby layout. I then started to mount the brackets. I laid a piece of wood across the top of each bracket and then lined up the bottom of that piece of wood with my line on the wall, and then marked the position of the screw holes in the bracket on the wall with a pencil. Then I screwed the brackets to the wall based on those marked screw hole positions. I had no choice but to mount these two brackets on either side of the window. It should be possible to have all of the other brackets closer together than this. I just screwed the brackets to the drywall with wood screws. I think this should be adequate for the weight they'll need to carry. Here's a sheet of the thicker but smaller foam board laid across those two brackets. I went on to mount brackets round the corner over the Hornby layout, a bit of a struggle due to needing to lean right across. There are some extra marks on the wall as I changed my mind a bit as to exactly where to mount the brackets. At this point I decided that I was going to proceed in this way, laying the thicker but smaller foam sheets across the brackets, and then putting the thinner, larger sheets on top, providing a bit larger surface for the layout. Things didn't exactly line up perfectly, but they were fairly close, and I may be able to adjust a bit to get better joins when I finalize things. Here's the sheet as I initially laid it across the window. I marked the ends of the top sheet where the window frame came so that I could cut out the foam sheet to sit back against the wall. I continued to mount brackets to the end of the wall. My idea at the end was to put the thick sheet right up to the end. The thin sheet would then go on top, butted up against the other thin sheet. This left a small gap at the end. I did the same at the far end of the layout, butting the thicker sheet right up against the end of the wall, then laying the thinner sheet on top, butted up against the end of the previous top sheet. I cut out a recess in the back of this sheet using my hot wire foam cutter, so that recess could fit around the window frame and the ends of the sheet could fit back against the wall so that its outer edge would line up with the other sheets. Again, things didn't line up perfectly, but they were close and can probably be nudged into alignment ultimately. Here's the shelf along that wall from the corner past the window, and here's the whole length of that arm. I didn't have any more full sheets of the thinner foam, but I did have some smaller pieces left over from making hills. I cut a piece from these to fit into the gap at the end here. And I did the same thing for the small gap at the other end. So now I basically had the makings for a continuous shelf along both walls. I think this should work, although reaching the part behind the layout is going to cause challenges. There's some clutter in the way, but actually working with that wall should mostly be easier. Next, I wanted to paint the top shelves. I bought latex craft paint from Michael's in a couple of colours. I bought 3 bottles of grey, but they only had one shade of grey and it seemed rather light. I also bought a bottle of brown and a bottle of green to mix in. These were 8 fluid-ounce bottles of paint, and I had some small bottles of black and dark brown on hand. I mixed up a brownish-greenish grey in a jar and brushed it on. It came out a bit streaky due to not being thoroughly mixed, but I thought that was okay. Here are the first 2 pieces, painted and dried, back in place. I went on to paint the next section, and tried that back in place. And finally the last section and the small gap filling piece. So now I had the whole top shelf painted. At this point I also took down the clocks from above the shelf, as they were going to have to go. And here's the far end where the second station will be. I've left that one clock up for now. Well, that's basically where I've got to for now. I may play around a little bit with some track, but I really need to wait until the vaccine and the shuttle controls arrive before I can do a lot more. By the way, the curves in the corner are second, third and fourth radius. Hopefully this should eliminate worries about rolling stock getting round, as the two main tracks are third and fourth radius, with second only on the shorter branch track. Anyway, hopefully I'll show you how this project progresses in future videos.